They didn't just break her, they made her sweep up the pieces. For 5 years Maeve scrubbed the blood off the great hall's stone floors, invisible, scentless, and scarred. To the Winter Ridge pack she was a broken Omega, a creature lower than the mud on their boots. They thought her wolf was dead. They thought she was nothing. Until the Alpha King arrived. Until his beast bypassed every highborn female, broke formation, and bowed at the bruised feet of the kitchen maid. Survival in the North did not belong to the strongest. It belonged to the quietest. Maeve Sullivan knew this better than anyone breathing within the stone confines of the Winter Ridge fortress. She kept her head down. She kept her mouth shut. She let her hair, a matted mess of dull copper, fall forward to obscure the jagged scar that tore from her left temple down to her jawline. Her knees rested on the freezing flagstones of the great hall. The lye soap was eating through the raw, cracked skin of her knuckles, but she didn't stop scrubbing. She pressed her weight into the stiff, bristled brush, working a stubborn grease stain out of the porous grey rock. Around her the keep was in a state of violent frenzy. Men shouted over the clatter of iron and wood. Servants sprinted past, their leather boots kicking up dust that settled right back onto the wet stones Maeve had just cleaned. "Move, half-breed!" A heavy boot clipped her hip, sending her sprawling into her wooden bucket. Dirty water sloshed over the rim, soaking through the thin, frayed wool of her tunic. The icy shock stole her breath. Maeve didn't look up. She recognized the scent. Pine needles and stale ale. Fenwick, one of the pack's enforcers. He didn't even break his stride. To him she wasn't a person. She was furniture. An obstacle. She righted the bucket with trembling hands, pulling her soaking tunic away from her ribs. The cold here was a living thing. It gnawed at the joints. It found the hollow spaces in an empty stomach. 5 years ago, Maeve had been a daughter of the Southern Vale, a pack wiped out in a territorial skirmish by the very wolves she now served. During the slaughter, her wolf had been driven deep into her, subconscious, traumatized, into a catatonic state, to spare Maeve's mind from shattering. Without her wolf, an Omega was nothing. Without a scent, she was worse than human. She was a dud, a broken thing, the Alpha of Winter Ridge. Rowan Hayes had kept her alive as a joke, a trophy of his total victory. "Let the Southern cur clean our boots," he had said. And so she did. Maeve, the sharp nasal bark of the head cook Greta echoed from the kitchen archway. "Are you sleeping on those stones? The king's vanguard is 2 leagues away. If this hall isn't spotless by the time his boots hit the courtyard, I'll have your hide for a rug." Maeve scrambled to her feet, ignoring the dull ache in her bad leg. "Yes, Greta." Her voice was a raspy whisper, unused and dry. She dragged the heavy bucket toward the kitchens, limping slightly. The air inside the kitchen was stifling thick with the scent of roasting boar, dripping fat, and baking bread. For a starving woman, it was a specialized form of torture. Her stomach cramped violently. She ignored it. Hunger was a constant companion, as familiar as the phantom pain in her scarred face. The kitchens were a hive of panic. The Alpha King Declan Croft was making his decennial tour of the Northern Territories. He was a warlord who had unified the continent's fractured packs through a brutal mix of diplomacy and bloodshed. Rumor held that he was looking for a mate to solidify his lineage. Every highborn female in Winter Ridge had been bathing in rosewater and practicing their curtsies for a month. Maeve dumped her filthy water down the drainage grate. She caught a glimpse of herself in the dark reflection of a polished copper pot. Pale, sunken cheeks. Eyes the color of dirty river water devoid of the luminescent spark that marked a wolf shifter. She looked away. Hope was a disease that killed faster than the winter rot, and Maeve had cured herself of it a long time ago. "You!" Greta snapped, thrusting a massive iron platter of raw root vegetables into Maeve's chest. "Take these to the cellar, and stay down there until the feast begins. I don't want the king seeing a mangy stray when he walks through my kitchens." Maeve gripped the cold iron, the weight pulling her shoulders down. "Yes, Greta." She turned and descended the dark, narrow stone steps into the root cellar. It was damp and smelled of earth and rotting potatoes. She found a clear spot on a wooden crate, sat down, and pulled her knees to her chest, trying to preserve whatever body heat she had left. Above her, the heavy wooden doors of the great hall groaned open. A horn blew a deep, mournful sound that rattled the dust from the cellar ceiling. The king had arrived. Maeve closed her eyes in the dark, wishing only for a few scraps of meat when the night was over. Declan Croft was tired. It was a bone-deep, soul-sucking exhaustion that sleep could no longer cure. He rode through the iron gates of Winter Ridge on a massive black destrier, his heavy fur cloak dusted with snow. Behind him rode 50 of the King's Guard, their armour clinking in synchronized, intimidating rhythm. Declan's jaw was locked. The icy wind bit at his face, pulling at the jagged, faded claw marks that crossed his throat, a souvenir from a rebel alpha who had thought the king was getting soft. The rebel skull now adorned a spike in the capital. Declan hadn't gone soft. He had just gone numb. His wolf, however, was restless. The beast paced constantly beneath his skin, agitated, clawing at his mind. Empty, the wolf snarled. Pack is empty. Den is empty. Everything is ash. My king. Rowan Hayes stood at the bottom of the keep's grand stone steps, flanked by his betas. Rowan was a broad, thickly muscled man with a cruel mouth and eyes that calculated every angle. He bowed, but it was shallow. Too shallow. "Winter Ridge welcomes you. Our fires are lit. Our meat is fresh." Declan dismounted smoothly, handing his reins to a squire who trembled under his gaze. He towered over Rowan by 4 inches. He didn't smile. He didn't offer his hand. He simply projected his aura, a crushing, suffocating wave of pure alpha dominance. Rowan's smug expression faltered. He choked slightly, his knees buckling an inch as the invisible weight of the king's power forced his inner wolf into submission. The betas behind Rowan whined audibly, dropping their gazes to the mud. Satisfied that the hierarchy was established, Declan pulled his aura back. "Let us hope your hospitality is better than your borders." "Rowan." Declan said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I saw fresh rogue tracks not 3 miles from your gate." Rowan flushed, recovering his composure. "Dealt with, sire. The winter makes them bold. Please come inside. The feast is prepared. The women of Winter Ridge are eager to welcome you." Declan suppressed a sneer. The women. The politics. He knew the game. Rowan would parade his daughters and his highest-ranking females in front of him, hoping Declan's beast would choose one, thereby elevating Rowan's status to the king's inner circle. It was pathetic. It was exhausting. He followed Rowan into the great hall. The heat of the massive hearth fires hit him instantly, melting the snow on his shoulders. The hall was packed with hundreds of wolves. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of forced laughter and clinking goblets. Declan took his seat at the high table, a heavy wooden chair draped in bear fur. He accepted a goblet of dark wine. He drank deeply, letting the alcohol burn down his throat. The feast began. It was exactly as he expected. A procession of perfectly groomed, heavily perfumed females approached the high table under the guise of serving the king. They leaned in too close, exposing their necks, their scents cloying, and artificial lavender musk heavy florals. His wolf recoiled, fake, weak, empty. "This is my eldest daughter, Sybil," Rowan said, gesturing to a striking blonde woman who was pouring Declan's second cup of wine. She looked at Declan from beneath thick eyelashes, her scent flaring with deliberate, desperate invitation. Declan didn't even look at her. "Wine is fine. Tell her to step back." Rowan's smile tightened. He flicked his fingers, and Sybil, looking thoroughly humiliated, retreated. Hours passed. The noise grew louder as the ale flowed. Declan sat in a state of detached boredom, picking at a roasted pheasant. His beast was pacing faster now, a low, constant hum of irritation in the back of his mind. The scents in the room were overwhelming. Sweat, roasted meat, sour ale, cheap perfume, fear, ambition. And then, underneath it all, a thread. Declan froze. His hand halted halfway to his mouth. His wolf stopped pacing. The beast stood perfectly still, nose in the air, ears swiveled forward. It was a scent that didn't belong in a feast hall. It smelled of wood ash, cold rain, lye soap, and something metallic. Blood. Old pain. But beneath that harsh exterior was a bass note that hit Declan's sensory cortex like a lightning strike. It was wild honey and crushed pine. It was rain on hot stone. Mine. The word didn't come from Declan. It came from the ancient primal entity sharing his soul. Declan slowly lowered his fork. His eyes, normally a hard, impenetrable grey, flashed with a ring of gold. He scanned the room, his enhanced vision cutting through the smoke and the crowds. Where was it? Down in the kitchens, the rush was ending. The main courses had been served. Now came the heavy, unglamorous work of clearing the butchered remains and hauling the massive platters back to the wash basins. You, Greta barked, pointing a greasy spoon at Maeve, who had just emerged from the cellar. Take the boar trolley out to the hall, bring back the empty trenchers from the low tables, and keep your head down. Maeve didn't argue. She moved to the heavy wooden trolley loaded with stacks of greasy cast-iron platters and the skeletal remains of a roasted boar. The wheels were old and squeaked terribly. She leaned her meagre weight into the cart, pushing it out of the kitchen archway and into the blinding light and deafening noise of the great hall. The heat hit her like a physical blow. She kept her eyes glued to the floor, navigating the cart through the narrow spaces between the long wooden tables. Pack members ignored her, stepping out of the way only to avoid getting grease on their clothes. She reached the first low table and began stacking the heavy trenchers onto her cart. Her arms trembled. She was so tired. "Look at it dragging its leg!" A voice hissed loudly. Sybil Rowan's daughter was sitting nearby, a cup of wine clutched in her hand, her pride still stinging from the king's rejection. She glared at Maeve, as if the broken Omega was personally responsible for her failure. Maeve ignored her. Silence was survival. She reached for a platter. Sybil casually extended her foot, hooking it around Maeve's bad ankle, just as Maeve put her weight down. Maeve went down hard. She hit the stone floor with a sickening crack. The wooden trolley tipped. A dozen iron platters and the greasy carcass of the boar crashed to the floor in a catastrophic explosion of noise. The great hall went dead silent. The music stopped. The laughter died. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the mess. Maeve lay on the floor gasping. A sharp, hot pain radiated from her wrist, which was bent at an unnatural angle. Grease covered her tunic. At the high table, Rowan Hayes stood up, his face purple with rage. The king was sitting right beside him. This was the ultimate insult. A filthy, broken stray ruining his grand feast. "You miserable, useless bitch!" Rowan roared, his voice echoing in the silent hall. He didn't just walk. He vaulted over the table. He was a massive alpha, and he was moving with intent to kill. The pack watched in silence. No one interfered in an alpha's discipline. Maeve curled into a ball, cradling her broken wrist, pressing her face into the cold stones. She closed her eyes. "Make it quick," she prayed. "Just let it be quick." Rowan reached her, grabbing a thick leather whip from the belt of a nearby guard. He raised his arm, the leather hissing as it pulled back. It never fell. A sound ripped through the hall. It wasn't a shout. It was a roar, a deafening, chest-rattling sound that shook the dust from the rafters and made every wolf in the room instinctively drop to their knees. It was the sound of a king's beast breaking its leash. Maeve didn't feel the blow. She heard a sickening crunch, a choked gasp, and the heavy thud of a massive body hitting the stones several feet away. She opened her eyes, peering through her tangled hair. Rowan Hayes was on the ground, clutching a shattered collarbone, his eyes wide with absolute terror. Standing over Maeve was the Alpha King. Declan Croft's chest heaved. His cloak was thrown back. His eyes were no longer grey. They were glowing molten gold. His claws were fully extended, dripping with the blood he had just drawn from Rowan's shoulder to throw him across the room. The air in the hall was completely sucked away, replaced by an aura so heavy, so dominant, that several Omegas in the back fainted. Declan breathed heavily, the golden eyes locking onto Rowan. "If you ever raise a hand to her again..." Declan's voice was distorted, layered with the gravelly resonance of his wolf. "I will tear your spine from your body and feed it to the crows." Rowan scrambled backward, pressing his forehead to the stones, whining in complete submission. "My king, she is nothing. She is a broken, stray silence." The command was absolute. Declan slowly turned his back on the Alpha of Winter Ridge. He looked down at the curled, trembling form of the girl covered in grease and ash. The monstrous, suffocating aura in the room vanished in a heartbeat. It was replaced by something else. A scent of ozone and pine, warm and fiercely protective. Maeve stared up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She pushed backward, trying to scramble away, terrified. The king of all wolves was looking at her. He was going to kill her himself. But Declan didn't reach for his sword. Before the wide, disbelieving eyes of the entire Winter Ridge pack, Declan Croft, the ruthless warlord, the Alpha King of the Unified Territories, dropped to his knees. He knelt in the spilled grease and the mud. He ignored her ruined clothes. He ignored the hideous scar on her face. He reached out with hands that had broken empires, his touch incredibly, impossibly gentle, and cupped her filthy cheek. He leaned forward, pressing his face into the curve of her neck, inhaling deeply. A rumbling purr vibrated in his massive chest, sending shockwaves through the silent hall. He rubbed his jaw against her scent gland, not biting, not claiming by force, but scent-marking her. A public declaration of absolute devotion. A king bowing to a maid. He pulled back just enough to look into her terrified, dull eyes. The gold in his gaze softened. "Found you," he whispered. The silence in the great hall was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that preceded a slaughter. Declan Croft did not stand immediately. He remained kneeling in the grease and spilled ale, his face buried in the crook of Maeve's neck. His breathing was harsh, rattling in the quiet room. To the onlookers, the Alpha King was claiming a mate. To Maeve, a massive predator had its jaws resting against her jugular. Her broken wrist throbbed. The pain was a sharp, brilliant white light cutting through the terrifying unreality of the moment. She didn't dare pull away. You didn't pull away from a wolf that large, that dominant, unless you wanted your throat ripped out. She held herself perfectly rigid, staring blindly at the ceiling rafters. Slowly, Declan lifted his head. The gold in his eyes was receding, replaced by the familiar, cold storm grey. He looked at her wrist, currently bent at a sickening angle. A low, dangerous rumble vibrated in his chest. He stood his movements fluid and terrifyingly fast. He didn't offer his hand. Instead, he bent and scooped her up. Maeve gasped, squeezing her eyes shut, expecting the drop, expecting the joke to end. He would throw her back into the mess laugh with Rowan, and the whipping would commence. But the drop never came. Declan held her against his broad chest. His heat soaked through her wet, freezing tunic instantly. He was a furnace. He held her securely but carefully, ensuring his arm didn't brush her shattered wrist. He turned to face the room. Rowan Hayes was still on the floor, clutching his ruined shoulder. His face was devoid of blood. The arrogance had been wiped clean, replaced by the instinctual terror of a lesser wolf facing an apex killer. "Cailan," Declan said. His voice didn't echo. It didn't need to. It cut through the room like a blade. The captain of the King's Guard, a massive brute of a man scarred from a dozen campaigns, stepped forward instantly. "My king, secure the perimeter of this keep. No one enters, no one leaves. If a single wolf from Winter Ridge attempts to cross the gates, mount their head on a pike." "Yes, sire." Declan shifted his gaze back to Rowan. "Your healer. Now, send him to my chambers. If he isn't there in 3 minutes, I will come back down here and rip your other arm off." Rowan nodded frantically, a pathetic, high-pitched whine escaping his throat. Declan didn't wait for a verbal response. He turned and walked toward the grand staircase. The crowd parted violently. Wolves shoved each other out of the way, desperate to avoid the king's path. Sybil, the daughter who had tripped Maeve, was pressed against a stone pillar, her hands covering her mouth, trembling violently as Declan passed. He didn't spare her a glance. Maeve kept her head tucked against Declan's fur cloak. She was acutely aware of the dirt on her face, the grease soaking her clothes, the foul smell of lye soap, and fear that clung to her. She was ruining his cloak. She tried to make herself smaller, pulling her good arm in tight. "Stop that," Declan murmured. His voice was low, meant only for her ears. She froze. "You don't need to shrink," he said, taking the stone steps 2 at a time without breaking a sweat. "Not anymore." She didn't answer. Words were dangerous. She had learned long ago that speaking only drew attention, and attention brought pain. He carried her down the long, torch-lit corridor of the guest wing. He kicked open the heavy oak door of the master suite. It was the finest room in Winter Ridge, draped in heavy tapestries and thick furs with a fire roaring in the massive hearth. Declan walked straight to the center of the room and gently deposited her on the edge of a massive 4-poster bed. The mattress was softer than anything she had touched in 5 years. She immediately tried to slide off onto the floor. Dirt belonged on the floor. Declan caught her good shoulder. His grip was firm, but entirely lacking aggression. "Stay." It was a command laced with just enough alpha timber to make her muscles lock into place. She sat stiffly on the edge of the velvet coverlet, clutching her broken wrist to her chest, her eyes darting toward the open door. Footsteps pounded in the hallway. An older man carrying a leather satchel nearly tripped into the room, gasping for breath. He smelled of dried sage, bitter roots, and absolute panic. Bran, the pack healer. Bran took one look at the king standing over the broken kitchen maid and swallowed hard. My king. The Alpha sent me." "Fix her arm," Declan ordered, stepping back to give the man room. He didn't leave. He crossed his arms over his chest and leaned against the stone mantel of the fireplace, watching. Bran approached Maeve as if she were made of glass and laced with poison. He had ignored her for years. Whenever she had suffered a burn in the kitchen or a kick from a guard, Bran had turned her away. Medicine was for wolves with value. Now, under the king's unblinking stare, Bran's hands shook as he reached for her wrist. This will hurt, girl," Bran muttered, pulling a small vial of clear liquid from his bag. "I have willow bark for the pain, sire, but setting the bone requires—" "Do it quickly," Declan interrupted. "And if you break the skin, I will break yours." Bran paled. He poured the liquid onto a cloth. "Drink this," he told Maeve. She stared at the cloth. She didn't move. She didn't trust Bran. She didn't trust the liquid. Declan pushed off the mantle. He crossed the room, took the vial from Bran, and held it to Maeve's lips. "It's willow bark. It will dull the fire. Drink." His eyes demanded compliance, but his hand was steady. Maeve parted her cracked lips and swallowed the bitter liquid. It burned on the way down, but a heavy, lethargic warmth quickly followed, spreading outward from her chest. "Hold her steady," Bran told the king. Declan sat on the mattress beside her. He wrapped one massive arm around her shoulders, pulling her back against his chest. He locked her good arm against her side. "Close your eyes," he told her. Maeve didn't. She watched Bran take her broken wrist in his hands. Bran pulled. There was a sickening grate of bone scraping against bone. Maeve didn't scream. 5 years of silent suffering had rewired her instincts. Screaming brought Greta's wooden spoon. Screaming brought Fenwick's boots. Instead, all the air left her lungs in a sharp hiss, and she bit down on her own bottom lip, hard enough to draw blood. Her body went rigid, a violent tremor racking her spine. Declan's arm tightened around her. A low, soothing rumble started in his chest, vibrating against her back. It was a sound a mother wolf made to a pup, an instinctual frequency designed to calm a panicked nervous system. "Done!" Bran gasped, wiping sweat from his forehead. He quickly bound her wrist in a tight leather splint. "Keep it elevated. It needs time to knit. Her wolf is dormant. The healing will be slow, human slow." "Get out," Declan said. Bran didn't need to be told twice. He packed his bag in 3 seconds flat and fled the room, shutting the heavy door behind him. The silence returned. The fire crackled. Maeve sat slumped against Declan's chest, the willow bark dragging her into a foggy stupor. The pain in her wrist had dulled to a deep, heavy ache. Declan didn't move away. He stayed sitting on the bed, holding the broken maid against him, staring at the closed door. A knock broke the quiet an hour later. Maeve flinched violently, her spine snapping straight. The willow bark had made her drowsy, but the sound of heavy knuckles on wood spiked her adrenaline back to lethal levels. Declan stood up slowly. "Enter." The door creaked open. Greta the head cook stood in the threshold. She was balancing a large silver tray loaded with roasted meats, fresh bread, and steaming broth. The woman who usually barked orders with a wooden spoon was now trembling so hard the silverware rattled against the plates. Greta's eyes darted to Maeve, sitting on the king's bed. Disgust warred with terror on her round face, but terror won. "Leave it on the table," Declan commanded. Greta hurried forward, set the tray down on a small round table near the fire, bowed awkwardly, and practically ran from the room. Declan walked over to the tray. He picked up a bowl of rich, dark beef stew and a thick slice of bread, then carried it back to the bed. He held it out to Maeve. "Eat." Maeve stared at the bowl. The smell hit her stomach like a physical punch. It had been 3 days since she had eaten anything more substantial than half a bruised apple she had stolen from the pig trough. Her mouth flooded with saliva. Her stomach cramped so violently she doubled over slightly. She reached out with her good hand, her fingers trembling, and took the bowl. She didn't use the spoon. The primal starving animal inside her took over. She brought the bowl to her lips and drank the hot stew, swallowing chunks of meat and potato whole. She shoved the bread into her mouth, chewing frantically. Terrified someone was going to walk through the door and snatch it away. She finished the bowl in under 30 seconds. She sat panting grease on her chin, her eyes darting to the remaining food on the table across the room. Declan watched her. His expression was unreadable, but the muscle in his jaw was ticking. He stood up, walked to the table, and poured a goblet of water. He brought it back to her. "Drink." Slowly. She took the goblet and drained it. The warmth in her stomach lasted exactly 1 minute. Then the rebellion began. Her stomach shrunken, and accustomed to nothing but scraps and mouldy crusts, violently rejected the rich, heavy stew. The cramp hit her so hard she dropped the silver goblet. It bounced on the thick rug. Maeve slapped her good hand over her mouth, her eyes widening in absolute panic. "Not here, not on the king's rugs." She scrambled off the bed, her legs tangling in her oversized tunic. She hit the floor, crawled blindly toward the hearth, and vomited the entire meal onto the stone hearth space just inches from the fire. She heaved until there was nothing left, her body shaking violently. Tears of acid burned her eyes. The humiliation was total. It was complete. She had ruined the king's meal. She had soiled his chambers. She collapsed onto the stone, coughing, curling into a tight ball. She waited for the blow. She waited for his boot to connect with her ribs. Useless. Disgusting. Stray. The words played on a loop in her head. Footsteps approached, slow, heavy. Maeve squeezed her eyes shut. A warm, wet cloth touched her face. She gasped, her eyes flying open. Declan was kneeling beside her. He had taken a linen towel from the wash basin, soaked it in warm water, and was gently wiping the sick from her chin and mouth. He didn't look disgusted. He looked furious, but the fury wasn't directed at her. It was a cold, quiet rage that seemed to bleed from his pores. "My fault," he said quietly, tossing the soiled cloth aside. "I should have known better. Your stomach can't handle rich meat. Bone broth first, slowly." He reached down and scooped her off the cold stone. He carried her back to the bed, laying her down against the pillows. Maeve stared at him, her chest heaving. Nothing made sense. The rules of her reality were fracturing. Alphas did not clean up vomit. Kings did not wipe the mouths of broken maids. "Why—" Her voice was a cracked, rusty whisper. It was the first word she had spoken to him. Declan stopped pulling the heavy furs over her legs. He looked at her. The harsh yellow light of the fire cast deep shadows across the scars on his neck. "Because you are mine," he said. It wasn't a romantic declaration. It was a statement of territorial fact. "And in my pack we do not let our own starve. We do not let them freeze." He turned away, walking to the hearth. He grabbed an iron shovel and an ash bucket, systematically cleaning the mess she had made. He didn't call a servant. He did it himself. Maeve watched him from the bed, exhaustion finally dragging her under. The willow bark, the shock, and the sheer mental toll of the last 2 hours were shutting her system down. When he finished, he washed his hands at the basin. He walked back to the bed and looked down at her. She was struggling to keep her eyes open, her uninjured hand gripping the edge of the fur blanket like a lifeline. "Sleep," he commanded softly. Where will you—" she mumbled, fighting the heavy pull of unconsciousness. Declan walked to a heavy wooden chair near the fire. He dragged it over to the side of the bed, sat down, and stretched his long legs out. He crossed his arms over his chest, his grey eyes locking onto the door. "I sit here," he said, "and I kill the first thing that tries to open that door. Rest Maeve." He knew her name. That was the last thought she had before the darkness took her. It wasn't a cold, empty darkness this time. It smelled of pine and ozone. It felt like a shield. For the first time in 5 years, Maeve Sullivan slept, and she did not dream of teeth in the dark. Morning in Winter Ridge did not arrive with warmth. It bled through the frosted glass of the chamber windows in thin, brittle shafts of grey light. Maeve woke with a violent jolt. A good hand instantly clamped over her mouth to stifle the scream building in her throat. She expected the sharp kick of Fenwick's boot. She expected the icy water of the wash buckets. Instead, she felt the heavy, suffocating warmth of fur pelts. She blinked rapidly, her vision swimming as the room came into focus. The tapestries, the massive hearth, the embers glowing a dull, angry orange. Memory crashed down on her like a collapsing roof. The feast, the fall, Rowan's whip, the king. She turned her head slowly, her breath hitching in her chest. Declan Croft was exactly where he had been when she lost consciousness. He sat in the heavy oak chair, his long legs stretched out toward the dying fire. He was awake. He was watching her. He looked exhausted. The shadows beneath his grey eyes were bruised and heavy, and a dark stubble coated his jaw. He hadn't slept. He had spent the entire night staring at the door, guarding a kitchen maid who smelled like vomit and lye. "You're awake," he said. His voice was a low rasp, dry from the long night. Maeve pushed herself backward, putting as much distance between them as the mattress allowed. Her back hit the heavy wooden headboard. Her broken wrist throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, a sharp reminder of reality. Declan didn't move toward her. He simply watched her panic with a calculated, infuriating calmness. "I need to—" Maeve started, her voice cracking. She cleared her throat, terrified of the sound of her own voice in this massive, silent room. "I need to get to the kitchens. Greta will do nothing." Declan interrupted softly. "If Greta so much as looks at you again, I will remove her eyes." Maeve froze. The casual brutality of his words didn't comfort her. It terrified her further. Power was a currency she didn't possess. To see it wielded so effortlessly on her behalf felt like a trap. "Why are you doing this?" She whispered, her hands gripping the fur coverlet. "I don't have a wolf. I don't have a scent. You're the king. You can have any female in the territories. Using me to humiliate Alpha Hayes. It's a cruel game, sire." Declan finally moved. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, clasping his massive hands together. "You think this is a game?" "I think I am a pawn." She replied the truth, slipping out before the survival instinct could bite it back. She braced for his anger. Declan just stared at her. The air in the room grew heavy, not with alpha dominance, but with an intense, suffocating sorrow. It was a terrifying thing to see on a warlord's face. 5 years ago?" Declan said, his voice a steady, rhythmic baritone. "The Southern Vale was slaughtered. I was fighting a rebellion in the east. By the time my scouts brought word, the ashes were cold. Rowan told me there were no survivors." Maeve looked down at her lap. Her throat tightened. "There weren't. Not really. When my beast caught your scent in that hall, it nearly tore my mind apart." Declan continued. "It didn't care about your scars. It didn't care that your wolf was buried so deep it feels like a corpse. It only knew that you were missing, and that you were found." He stood up, towering over the bed. Maeve flinched. Declan stopped, immediately recognizing the micro-expression. He took a deliberate step back. "A bath has been drawn in the adjoining room," he said, shifting his tone back to the detached authority of a commander. "There are fresh clothes, human clothes for now. I will send a servant to help you wash. I will wait out here." He turned his back to her and walked toward the window, clasping his hands behind his back, staring out at the frozen courtyard below. Maeve didn't argue. She carefully slid off the bed, clutching her splintered arm to her chest. She slipped into the bathing room. It was a luxury she had never seen. A massive copper tub sat in the center of the room, steaming hot water radiating heat into the frigid air. Vials of oils and blocks of milled soap sat on a small wooden table. A young servant girl, no older than 16, stood terrified in the corner. She held a stack of thick, clean towels. "My lady," the girl squeaked, dropping into a deep, trembling curtsy. Maeve flinched at the title. "Don't call me that. Just help me with my tunic. My arm." The girl approached with wide eyes, helping Maeve peel the stiff, grease-stained wool over her head. As the tunic dropped to the floor, the servant girl gasped quickly, slapping a hand over her mouth. Maeve looked at herself in a tall, polished bronze mirror propped against the wall. It was a map of survival. Her ribs protruded sharply against pale skin. Faded white lines crisscrossed her back and shoulders, souvenirs of Greta's wooden spoons and the guards' riding crops. Bruises in varying shades of purple and yellow mottled her hips and thighs. And then there was the scar on her face, pulling the skin taut and ruining the symmetry of her jaw. She looked like a corpse that had been dragged behind a horse. "The water is getting cold," Maeve said softly, breaking the girl's horrified stare. The bath was an agonizing kind of heaven. The hot water stung her cracked skin, but it melted the bone-deep chill that had lived inside her for half a decade. The soap smelled of lavender, not lye. The girl washed her hair twice, working the knots and grease out with gentle, terrified hands, terrified the king would hear Maeve cry out. When it was over, the girl helped her dress in a soft woolen dress, dyed a deep, rich indigo. It was too big, swallowing her thin frame, but it was warm. It didn't smell like ash. Maeve stepped back into the main chamber. Declan turned from the window. He looked at her. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a compliment. He just looked at her as if she were the only solid object in a room full of smoke. "Better," he said simply. Then someone knocked on the main door. The sound was sharp, demanding. Declan's jaw set. The brief moment of quiet shattered. The king was back. "Enter!" Declan barked. The heavy oak door opened. Cailan, the massive captain of the King's Guard, stepped inside his armor, gleaming dully in the morning light. He kept his eyes strictly on his king, ignoring Maeve entirely. "Sire," Cailan said, his voice a low rumble. "Alpha Hayes requests an audience. He says it is a matter of pack law. He has gathered his betas in the Great Hall." Declan's lips curled into a faint, terrifying sneer. "Pack law. He claims the girl is his property. A prisoner of war. By Northern Treaty, the Crown cannot seize a pack's spoils without compensation or a challenge of blood." Maeve felt the blood drain from her face. Her knees buckled slightly, but she caught herself against the heavy oak bedpost. Property. The word was a shackle. Rowan was going to use the ancient laws to force the king's hand. Declan didn't look at her. He looked at Cailan. "Gather the guard." Declan said, his voice dropping an octave, taking on the resonant, vibrating quality of his wolf. "Line the walls of the Great Hall. No one sits." "Yes, sire." Cailan bowed and exited. Declan turned to Maeve. He walked across the room, stopping 2 feet away. He held out his massive, scarred hand. "Walk with me," he said. Maeve stared at his hand. "He will demand my return. He has the law." "He has nothing." Declan replied. "I am the law. Take my hand, Maeve." She hesitated, then slowly raised her good hand and placed it in his. His fingers closed around hers. They were warm rough with calluses and completely engulfing. For the first time in 5 years, Maeve walked out of a room instead of being dragged. The descent to the Great Hall felt like a march to the gallows. Maeve walked beside the Alpha King, her hand enveloped in his. With every step down the grand stone staircase, the noise below grew louder. It wasn't the raucous, drunken cheer of the night before. It was an agitated, buzzing murmur, the sound of a hornet's nest that had been kicked. As they rounded the final landing, the Great Hall came into view. It was packed. Nearly every adult member of the Winter Ridge Pack was present, standing shoulder to shoulder. The air was thick with the scent of fear, aggression, and nervous sweat. Lining the perimeter of the room, standing at parade rest with heavy broadswords drawn, were the King's Guard. 50 massive wolves, their armor black as pitch, their eyes locked forward. At the far end of the hall, standing before the high table, was Rowan Hayes. His right arm was heavily bandaged and strapped tightly to his chest in a leather sling. His face was pale, drawn tight with pain, but his eyes burned with a desperate, cornered fury. He was flanked by his 3 betas, all of them looking acutely uncomfortable under the gaze of the King's Guard. When Declan and Maeve stepped off the bottom stair, the murmuring died instantly. Complete, suffocating silence fell over the hall. Maeve wanted to shrink. She wanted to pull her hand free from Declan's and press herself into the darkest corner of the stonework. Hundreds of eyes tracked her. Eyes that had looked right through her yesterday, now stared with a mixture of shock, disgust, and disbelief. She was wearing a noblewoman's dress. She was holding the king's hand. Declan didn't walk. He stalked. He pulled Maeve along gently, but his pace was deliberate, predatory. He walked straight down the center aisle, the crowd parting before him like water. He didn't stop until he was 10 feet from Rowan. "You requested an audience, Hayes. Declan said. He didn't shout, but his voice carried to the rafters. Speak. Rowan swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thick throat. He looked at Maeve, his lip curling involuntarily before forcing his eyes back to the king. My king. Rowan began, his voice tight. I mean no disrespect to the crown, but there are laws that govern the Northern Territories. Laws you swore to uphold when you unified the Pacts. Get to the point. Declan said, his tone bored, though the muscle jumping in his jaw betrayed his rage. The girl, Rowan said, gesturing toward Maeve with his good arm. She is a survivor of the Southern Vale, a pack that challenged Winter Ridge and lost. By right of conquest, she belongs to this pack. She is a thrall. Property. The word echoed in the quiet hall. Maeve tightened her grip on Declan's hand involuntarily. You took her from my hall. Rowan continued, gaining a fraction of his confidence back. You injured an alpha in his own keep. I demand the law be recognized. I demand compensation for the insult, and I demand the return of my property. A low, collective murmur rippled through the Winter Ridge wolves. Rowan was playing a dangerous game, but he was legally right. In wolf culture, property rights born of conquest were sacred. Declan stared at Rowan. He didn't blink. He didn't shout. He slowly released Maeve's hand. Maeve felt a sudden, terrifying spike of panic. He's giving me back. The law is too strong. He can't risk a rebellion over a broken maid. She took a half-step backward. Declan reached up and unclasped the heavy iron brooch holding his thick black fur cloak. He pulled the massive garment from his shoulders and let it drop to the stone floor. Beneath it he wore a simple black leather tunic, highlighting the sheer, terrifying width of his shoulders and the thick muscles of his arms. Compensation, Declan repeated softly. He took a step toward Rowan. The three betas flanking the alpha instinctively took a step back, their beasts whining in the presence of the king's approaching aura. You want compensation for the insult, Rowan. Declan's voice began to vibrate. The air in the room grew heavy, the atmospheric pressure dropping so rapidly that several torches along the walls flickered and died. Sire the law. Rowan started stepping back, the arrogance suddenly evaporating. The law. Declan snarled, the sound ripping through the hall like thunder. Says you claim the spoils of a defeated pack. The law does not say you take a daughter of a noble house, strip her of her rank, starve her, and beat her until her wolf goes catatonic. Declan closed the distance in a fraction of a second. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply reached out and clamped his massive hand around Rowan's throat. Rowan choked, his eyes bulging as the king lifted him clean off the ground with one arm. The Alpha of Winter Ridge kicked his feet in the air, clawing uselessly at Declan's iron grip. Treason! One of Rowan's betas shouted, drawing a blade. Before the beta could take a single step, Kaelan was there. The massive captain slammed the pommel of his broadsword into the beta's temple, dropping him to the stones like a sack of grain. The remaining King's Guard drew their weapons in unison, a terrifying chorus of ringing steel. No one else moved. Winter Ridge was paralyzed. You speak to me of laws. Declan whispered, his face inches from Rowan's turning purple face. I am the king. I wrote the laws you hide behind, and you have broken the highest of them all. Declan turned his head, his glowing gold eyes finding Maeve in the crowd. Maeve Sullivan! Declan roared, ensuring every single wolf in the keep heard the name. Daughter of Alpha Corin Sullivan of the Southern Vale, a pack I ordered you to parley with Rowan, a pack you slaughtered for your own ambition. A collective gasp swept through the hall. The broken kitchen maid was an Alpha's daughter. Declan dropped Rowan. The heavy Alpha hit the floor, gasping and hacking, clutching his throat, his broken collarbone, screaming in agony. Declan stepped over him, walking back to Maeve. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked only at her. Your debts are erased. Declan said, his voice projecting across the silent hall. "Your servitude is ended. Any wolf in this keep, whoever laid a hand on you, will answer to my guard before sunset." He stopped in front of her. He reached out gently, taking her uninjured hand. Deep inside Maeve's chest, buried under 5 years of ice ash and terror, something shifted. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't a sudden burst of power. It was a heartbeat. A single heavy thump in the back of her mind. Her wolf had heard its name. Declan felt it. His eyes flared brighter gold. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, right over the scars left by the lye soap. "Pack your things. Alpha Haze," Declan said over his shoulder, never breaking eye contact with Maeve. "You are stripped of your title. You are stripped of your lands. You have 1 hour to leave this keep before Kaelin takes your head." The king turned to the captain of the guard. "Burn the kitchens," Declan ordered coldly. "And prepare the horses. We ride for the capital." Smoke choked the northern sky. It was thick, oily, and black, carrying the bitter scent of burning fat and aged timber. Maeve sat atop a massive black destrier securely anchored against Declan's chest. The king's arms were wrapped around her, holding the reins, creating a fortress of heat and leather that shielded her from the biting wind. Behind them, Winterridge was a hive of panicked ants. Kaelin had executed the king's order with ruthless efficiency. The kitchens, the site of Maeve's torment, the symbol of her degradation, were currently burning to the ground. They rode through the iron gates. No one stopped them. No one dared. Rowan Hayes was somewhere in the frozen mud, a broken alpha with no pack, no keep, and no future. Maeve stared straight ahead. She didn't look back at the fortress. For 5 years she had prayed for the stones of Winterridge to crumble and crush her. Now leaving it behind felt like peeling off a layer of her own skin. It was painful, raw, and completely disorienting. She was free. The concept was too massive to comprehend. It sat in her mind like a foreign object. "Breathe," Declan murmured, his voice rumbling against her spine. She inhaled sharply, realizing she had been holding her breath for the last mile. "You are shaking," he noted. He didn't pull the horse to a halt, but he shifted his grip, pulling his heavy fur cloak tighter around her small frame. "I don't know how to do this," Maeve whispered. The wind whipped the words from her mouth, but she knew his enhanced hearing caught them. "I don't know how to be a person anymore. I only know how to be a shadow." Declan was quiet for a long time. The rhythmic thud of the destrier's hooves against the packed snow filled the silence. "Then you will be my shadow," Declan finally said, "until you are ready to stand in the sun. I am in no rush, Maeve." They rode for 10 hours. The brutal, jagged peaks of the north gradually gave way to the rolling, pine-covered foothills of the Central Territories. The temperature rose marginally, the bitter frost replaced by a damp, heavy chill. When dusk fell, Kaelin signaled a halt. The King's Guard established a camp with terrifying efficiency. Within minutes, heavy canvas tents were pitched, and a roaring fire was built in the center of the clearing. The guards kept their distance, establishing a wide perimeter around the king and the woman he had claimed. They didn't stare. They treated her with the exact same deferential silence they gave their warlord. Declan dismounted first. He reached up and lifted Maeve from the saddle, setting her down gently. Her legs were numb from the ride, and she stumbled. He caught her waist, instantly steadying her. "Sit by the fire," he commanded, gently guiding her to a heavy log draped with a wool blanket. She sat, holding her splinted wrist against her stomach. Declan vanished into the darkness of the camp, returning a few moments later with a tin cup of hot, clear broth and a piece of soft, flat bread. He handed it to her and sat down beside her, the firelight catching the gold flecks in his grey eyes. "Slowly," he reminded her. Maeve took a small sip. The broth was rich, salty, and warm. It didn't churn her stomach like the stew had. She broke off a tiny piece of bread and chewed it methodically. She felt Declan watching her not with pity, but with a fierce, quiet focus. "Why didn't you kill him?" Maeve asked, her voice raspy. She stared into the flames. "Rowan, you let him live. Death is a release." Declan replied coldly. He stretched his long legs out, crossing his heavy boots at the ankles. Rowan's identity was tied to his power, his keep, his status. I stripped him of all three. Now he is a rogue. The packs he bullied will hunt him. The winter will freeze him. He will live out the rest of his short life looking over his shoulder, knowing he is prey. It is a far worse fate than a quick blade. Maeve processed this. It was a warlord's justice. Brutal, absolute. And me? She asked finally, turning her head to look at him. What is my fate? I am a broken Omega. Even if you drag me to the capital, your pack will never accept me. A king needs a queen who can fight, who can breed strong heirs. My wolf is gone, Declan. It's dead. Declan didn't flinch at her bluntness. He reached out and gently brushed a stray lock of matted copper hair from her forehead. His touch sent a localized shockwave through her nervous system. Your wolf is not dead, Declan said. She is in hiding, and she has every right to be. They broke your body, Maeve. They fractured your mind, but they did not take your soul. I felt her today, in the hall. Maeve shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. It was just fear. I was terrified. It was a heartbeat, Declan corrected. I heard it. I felt it. He leaned in closer. The scent of pine and ozone washed over her, thick and intoxicating. It wasn't suffocating. It was an anchor. You don't need to fight for my pack. Declan whispered, his face inches from hers. You don't need to prove anything to anyone in the capital. You are my mate, the other half of my soul. If the pack doesn't accept you, I will burn the capital to the ground, and we will build a new one. He pressed his forehead against hers. He didn't demand she sent him back. He just stayed there, sharing his warmth, offering his strength without asking for a toll. Deep in the dark, frozen cavern of Maeve's subconscious, the phantom heartbeat thumped again. Twice. A tiny, fragile thread of warmth bloomed in her chest. It was the faintest trace of wild honey. The capital was a fortress of pale stone and black iron, carved directly into the side of a massive mountain. It was beautiful, severe, and crawling with thousands of wolves. As the king's vanguard approached the main gates, a deafening horn sounded from the watchtowers. Word had travelled fast. The northern runners had brought news of the king's actions at Winter Ridge, before his retinue even crossed the central borders. The king had rejected the highborns. The king had nearly killed an alpha. The king was bringing home a broken thrall. The main courtyard was packed. Hundreds of high-ranking pack members, nobles and warriors stood in perfect tense formation. The silence was heavy, thick with judgment and anticipation. Maeve felt the crushing weight of their stares the moment Declan's horse passed through the gates. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The urge to bolt to find a dark cellar and hide was nearly paralyzing. She gripped the heavy fur of Declan's cloak so tightly her knuckles turned white. Look at me. Declan ordered, his voice slicing through her panic. She craned her neck, looking up at his sharp jawline. They are nothing. Declan told her, his grey eyes locked on the sea of wolves ahead. They breathe because I allow it. They eat because I conquered the lands that feed them. Their judgment is dust. You are the only thing that matters. He pulled the destrier to a halt in the centre of the courtyard. Kaelin and the guard immediately formed a defensive ring around them. Declan dismounted. He didn't call for a squire. He didn't acknowledge the bowing nobles. He turned and reached up for Maeve. He didn't just help her down. He lifted her carefully and set her on her feet, keeping one arm securely wrapped around her waist. He turned her to face the crowd. A collective murmur rippled through the courtyard. They saw her bruised, sunken cheeks. They saw the jagged scar bisecting her face. They saw the crude leather splint on her wrist. They couldn't smell a wolf on her. She was a void. At the front of the crowd, an older alpha one of Declan's chief counselors stepped forward. He bowed deeply, but his eyes were hard. "My king," the counselor said, his voice carrying over the silent courtyard. "We rejoice at your safe return, but we do not understand. You bring a scentless stray into the heart of the capital. The rumors say you claim her as mate. Surely this is a misunderstanding. A king cannot mate a broken thing." Declan's arm tightened around Maeve's waist. He didn't yell. The terrifying, crushing weight of his aura simply dropped over the courtyard like a lead blanket. Several wolves in the front row gasped, dropping to their knees instantly. The counselor choked, his face going pale as his inner beast was forced into submission by the sheer, staggering power of the king. "You forget your place, counselor," Declan said softly. The sound carried perfectly. "You look at my mate, and you see a broken thing. I look at you, and I see a dead man if you do not lower your eyes." The counselor immediately dropped his gaze to the cobblestones, trembling. Declan turned slightly, looking down at Maeve. "Show them," he whispered to her. Maeve looked at the hundreds of wolves kneeling in the dirt. These were the most powerful wolves on the continent. Warlords, highborns. And they were terrified, not of her, but of the man who held her. But Declan wasn't holding her back. He was holding her up. She closed her eyes. She stopped fighting the memory of the ash pit. She stopped hiding from the pain of the whip. She let it all wash over her, let the trauma surface. But this time she didn't let it drown her. She reached through the dark, through the ice, and grabbed hold of the tiny spark Declan had ignited the night before. She pulled. Inside her mind, a wolf opened its eyes. It wasn't a pristine, arrogant beast. It was a survivor. It was scarred, lean, and utterly feral. And it was awake. A sudden sharp gasp rippled through the front lines of the crowd. Maeve opened her eyes. They were no longer the dull, dirty color of river water. They were glowing a brilliant, luminescent amber. And then the scent hit them. It rolled off her in a massive, suffocating wave. It bypassed the damp chill of the courtyard entirely. It was wild honey. It was crushed pine needles. It was rain hitting hot stones. It was the scent of an alpha-born female concentrated by 5 years of suppression, detonating in the center of the capital. It was absolute, undeniable proof of a true mate. The murmurs stopped. The judgment vanished. The entire courtyard, hundreds of wolves lowered their heads until their foreheads touched the cold stone, exposing their necks in total instinctual submission. They weren't bowing to Declan's threat anymore. They were bowing to her. Declan smiled. It was a fierce, terrifying expression of total victory. He released her waist, took her uninjured hand, and raised it high in the air for the entire capital to see. They had tried to break her. They had tried to turn her into ash. But as Maeve stood in the center of the royal courtyard, her golden eyes blazing, she realized they had made a fatal mistake. Ash was the perfect fertilizer for a forest fire. And the king had just handed her a torch. Did you feel the tension when the king's wolf finally broke its leash? The dynamic between a shattered survivor and a ruthless ruler brought to his knees by fate is just beginning. In the coming parts, Maeve must navigate a dangerous court that wants her dead, while Declan fights to heal the wolf they tried to destroy. If you loved this intensely grounded, emotional start to Maeve and Declan's journey, please hit that like button, share this video with your fellow romance lovers, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next epic chapter.